Everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today on a extremely important and predominant topic. I say predominant because in our present society, most people have some form of adrenal fatigue or at least adrenal dysfunction. I will obviously talk a lot more about this topic as we go along here through the presentation. Um, but let me start by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Hirani. I did my residency and board certification in family practice in Michigan. After some time, I practiced in a traditional family practice office and realized there was a lot of things I couldn't treat within the boundaries of mainstream medicine. Anyway, that's when I started exploring more alternative forms, and here I am today. That was 20 years ago. So my approach is that I try to combine the best of both worlds. I use traditional medicine when absolutely necessary. My preference is to work with natural or functional medicine, where we really try to look for the root cause, see what's going on in the body, and bring the body under balance. Okay, so thank you again for joining me today. A couple of things. One, this presentation is being recorded, so you will all get a recording of this presentation. And two, in your chat box, please feel free at any time to go ahead and type in questions as they come to you. I will be at the end of this topic addressing all of those questions, but whenever they come to mind, just go ahead and put them in and we'll talk about all of those at the end, okay? Thank you. So let's get started here. Um, so, what is stress? Stress is a silent epidemic pervading today's society, or as it's been said, the mouse that roars. So, what's the purpose of our adrenal glands? Those are the glands that help our body cope with stress or regulate our stress response. The adrenal glands make various different hormones, the biggest one known as cortisol, but also adrenaline, DHEA, and others, which affect all our major physiological processes in our body. Under continual stress, hormone levels begin to drop, leading to something called burnout. What is this condition known as HPA axis dysfunction or adrenal fatigue? Adrenal fatigue is more of a layman's term, and we'll get into the terminology a little bit later on as well. But anyway, this is a collection of signs and symptoms that result when the adrenal hormones that we're producing cannot adequately meet the demands of the stress that we're facing. Okay. So, adrenal fatigue can usually be caused by intense or prolonged stress, but it can also occur during or after any kind of an acute stress or a chronic infection. Okay, like a sudden trauma or just, COVID is a perfect example. You can throw somebody into an adrenal dysfunction. Stress can be physical, so there's all kinds of stress, and our body treats all stress equally. There's no discrimination. Okay, so there's physical stress. Suppose we're at work and we're always sitting in a freezing cold room 8 hours of the day, every day. That's a physical stressor. Okay, there's emotional stress, right? Your boss is mean and yells at you at work, and it's very difficult for you to kind of handle that type of stressor, right? There's dietary stress. We're drinking 5 cups of coffee a day or eating too many sugars and carbs. There's environmental stressors, toxins that we're being exposed to, too much mercury or lead in our body. And then there's infectious stress, as I mentioned before, some sort of an infectious disease. Again, our body treats all stress the same. What is that reaction that occurs? Our cortisol goes up. So whether your boss yells at you at work or whether you've had too much caffeine that day, the response is the same, a high cortisol, which is the main stress hormone. Okay. So it's important to note that. However, that being said, what are some of the main drivers of adrenal dysfunction? Okay, so lots of different things can cause stress, right? We have stressors all around us. Um, some of the main drivers, if we can make sure we really kind of work through some of these things over here, a lot of our symptoms of adrenal fatigue will improve. Okay. Sleep is number one. Anybody that's dealing with adrenal dysfunction, HPA axis dysfunction, sleep is going to be critically important. It's our battery charger. Okay. Um, Perceived stress. Now, notice, the word is mentioned as perceived stress because it's not just actual stress on the body, but perceived stress on the body, right? Before something actually happens, if you start to really get anxious about it, ruminate over it, think about it, and constantly, um, you know, just stress on that fact, even though it hasn't happened, that's going to also cause a rise in cortisol and also lead to the release of the stress hormone, right? Hence, it's always been said, oh, don't worry about something until it actually happens, right? And that's, of course, a skill or a practice that, we need to work on. But I do think it's important to differentiate between actual stress and perceived stress. To our body, there's no difference between the two. Okay. And we'll talk more about that later on as well. Circadian rhythm is very important. So if we have different, patterns every day in terms of when we eat and when we sleep and when we wake up, and if we do shift work, types of occupations, all of these things are also a big driver of adrenal dysfunction. And seemingly unrelated things can also lead to adrenal dysfunction, like gut inflammation and blood sugar instability. Okay. And we'll talk more about why later on. So, why do we even have a stress response in the body? What's the purpose of this? Well, the main purpose of this is to maintain effective blood supply to the brain, heart, and muscle for immediate survival, known as fight or flight. Okay. So increase energy production for vital short term needs at the expense of long term metabolic dysfunction or survival. Okay. Um, so Henselian, he's known as the father of modern medicine. He specifically said, although we cannot avoid stress, we can learn a great deal about how to keep its damaging side effects, known as distress, to a minimum. And what we've seen is that many common diseases are largely due to errors in our adaptive response to stress rather than direct damage to our body by other things. Okay. So it's a disease of adaptation. Unfortunately, again, in today's world, we just see a lot of this. Okay. He's actually one of the first physicians which identified such a thing as stress in the body. So very, very interesting work and research of Hanselier. This is the key. So, what we're dealing with here is something known as the autonomic nervous system. All right. We have basically two sides of our autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic nervous system, which is like the gas pedal, that's our fight or flight response. Okay. That's what's used for protection and survival. That's when we have an acute stressor, like that tiger coming in front of us. Okay. And then we have the other side, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our brake pedal. That's known as the rest and digest, relax, growth and development, right? That's what we're doing when we're doing a feel good activity like a hobby or just resting and sleeping and that sort of thing. And obviously, we need a balance of these, right? We don't want to be in overdrive all the time, but yet we don't want to be on underdrive all the time either, because then we have no motivation to do anything either. So the key is balance. And what we're going to be talking about today is adrenal dysfunction due to an imbalance in this autonomic nervous system, which typically gets its beginnings with this acute stressor, which becomes chronic. Okay. Now, acute stress is normal to our body. We're supposed to have, that's why we have a stress response, so that we could deal with acute stressors. The problem becomes when those acute stressors are chronic, our body actually has no mechanism, believe it or not, to deal with chronic stress above what our threshold can handle. Right? So if we're constantly pressing on that gas pedal or if we're constantly in sympathetic mode, we're going to have very little battery to sustain a lot of our body functions. So let's talk about how this whole stress cycle gets initiated. How does the beginnings of multiple diseases in the body even start? Okay. So as you can see on number one there, we have the sympathetic nervous system, right? Which is the fight or flight response. This becomes activated in response to some sort of a stressor. Number two, that whole stress response system begins a cascade of all these what are supposed to be protective physiological responses to help us fight or flight. Again, think of the tiger in front of us, okay? Number three, certain hormones like adrenaline are basically released. What do these do? They increase our heart rate and blood pressure and respiration. So we have energy and biochemical needs to drive that stress response or the fight or flight. Then, if that goes on long enough, adrenaline, noradrenaline only last a short time. And if we need to continue the stress response, then we also start to release cortisol, okay, which also comes from the adrenal glands. And finally, number five, within 15 minutes of the onset of stress, those cortisol levels surge. and they remain elevated for several hours to give us that energy to cope with and respond to the stressor appropriately. We need this to happen. This is normal in our body. Problems begin if we don't shut down that stress response, if it goes on and on and on and on and keeps reverberating. Okay. Some ways we can shut down that stress response are meditation, yoga, sleep, relaxation, basically triggering what's known as the vagal nerve in our body, which helps us go into the parasympathetic nervous system. And again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Let's think about it in terms of analogies, right? Suppose we are exposed to that tiger in the jungle, right? What happens when that tiger is attacking us? Well, we go into that stress response, fight or flight, or cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up, etc., right? Which is great. We want to be able to fight that tiger. Hopefully, then, we escape, cortisol levels go back down, and everything goes back to normal. What happens though if we're constantly, meeting those tigers every single day, right? All the time? Now that's not such a good thing because now we're reverberating the stress response. We're not shutting it off. Now cortisol is chronically up, adrenalines are chronically up, throwing us into that fight or flight response. Well, while we're in that sympathetic mode, our body is temporarily ignoring or shutting down the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And the parasympathetic nervous system houses a lot of important day to day chemical processes like healing and repair, digestive system, immune regulation, um, hormone restoration. Okay. So, again, if we're constantly ignoring all those processes, eventually there's going to be dysfunction and they're not going to work optimally or adequately. And you can see over time, there begins to be this breakdown or dysfunction in our body processes. Okay. And that's why when you look at the research, stress causes all kinds of health issues. Okay. It's kind of like the other analogy here is, when the body perceives stress, everything else in our body needs to be put aside so that the stress and survival response can take over. Kind of like the emergency vehicle, right? That emergency vehicle is using the same road as regular non-emergency cars are using, right? So the cars have to be pushed aside so the emergency vehicle can take priority, which is exactly what happens in our body when those cortisols and adrenalines go up. They take priority above everything else. Yeah. That can happen forever. Eventually, this whole process wears down and fatigues. Our body can't keep endlessly producing all this cortisol or adrenaline, right? Those resources get fatigued or worn out. So eventually, what happens if that stress is not short-lived is that those high cortisols start to drop and become low cortisols. Okay. Now we can't produce adequate cortisol to help us even deal with that particular stressor. All right. So as you can see over here in the picture, we've got the stress brain loop, right? We've got the chronic stress, which increases those glucocorticoids, which are again cortisol, et cetera. That cortisol, as it keeps getting released, it actually goes and causes cellular changes in a part of our brain called the hippocampus. Part of that hippocampus's job is to release more cortisol, okay, or even other hormones. So now that that part of the brain kind of gets turned down or damaged because of all this high cortisol and glucocorticoids, now there's a reduced regulation or production of cortisol. Now, instead of high cortisols, we see low cortisols. And that's kind of what adrenal fatigue entails, is when we have too little cortisol to address or deal with body functions and life stressors. Okay. Our stress response gets broken. It can no longer help us. And not only do we see mental, emotional consequences of this, but we also see physical consequences of this. Okay. So it becomes this vicious cycle. This slide probably looks familiar to a lot of you, right? How many of you, when you're at work, you're kind of thinking about sleep, and then when you're trying to sleep at night, you're thinking of work, right? This whole vicious cycle. So let's kind of look at this, right? So what happens when that brain, the hypothalamus and the brain, they're the H part of things, it picks up stress. It acts like a sensor, right? It goes, there's all the stress going on, right? So then it starts to command the adrenals. It says, come on, adrenals, there's all the stress going on. We need to do certain things to help with the fight or flight response. So the adrenal then speaks to the body. What does the adrenal say? It says, all right, body, we need fuel, we need energy. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to increase blood sugar. You're going to do that by breaking up muscle because our muscles store a lot of our sugar, right? So, break up muscle and get that extra storage form of glucose. I also want you to break down the muscle and get glutamine. And if need be, break it down even further so we can make our own glucose. All right. And it also tells the body, all right, we got to hold on to body fat. Let's increase body fat. Why? Because body fat is our protection against chronic stress, especially, when humans were kind of first to developed or created, was this whole sort of famine response, right? And the main stressor of the body was famine. And so one of the ways our body kind of works is to hold on to fat, to store nutrition, right, during times of famine. Now, that's not a problem in our modern society, at least in many places, or at least in our country. However, that response, that physiological response in the body hasn't changed. That's still what it used to be when, Homo sapiens were first created, okay, or animals, even mammals for that matter. Anyway, the other thing that the adrenal tells the body, it says, okay, I want you to break down bone because we need calcium. We need calcium to help us through the stress response. So break down bone as much as you need to grab the calcium. Okay. So these are all acute things that happen to that acute stress. All right. So that could be like a good thing gone bad, right? So help. If the stress response doesn't get arrested, more help is on the way. What is that more help? Now, thyroid function gets reduced because the thyroid really starts to produce all this increased thyroid output. It says, okay, I need more energy. Let's help with the stress response. We need to preserve the immune system. We're going to not spend our effort in creating all these antibodies. Okay, we got to help with the fight or flight. And that also reduces gut immunity. Okay. So now these root causes explain the tree. What do I mean by that, right? If you have prolonged storage of fat, not just in that acute time, you get overweight, you get obese, right? You build fat. If you have prolonged blood sugar making, right, by your body, you develop prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. If you have prolonged loss of muscle, you get muscle injury, right? You get aches and pains, you get more weight gain. If you have prolonged thyroid necessity, you start to have underactive thyroid function. If you have prolonged loss of bone, you get earlier bone disease. If you get prolonged lack of antibody production, you get poor immunity and you get sick easier, right? So again, these things are meant to happen in the short term. If they happen in the long term, it causes disease, the effects of chronic stress. Okay. Just more on the left side, it's what, those acute body responses that occur to acute stress and the chronic health conditions that come out of that. And when you have time later on, you can certainly look through that slide in more detail. Now, slide in here because I really want to make it a point that adrenal fatigue is a very layman's term. You may have heard from your doctors or other people that there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. The adrenals don't actually get fatigued. And that is true. The adrenals don't actually get fatigued. It's that feedback loop that we spoke about, right? Where the brain is supposed to produce cortisol, that goes and speaks to the adrenals. The adrenals keep producing high cortisols, which goes damages the part of the brain which is supposed to produce more cortisol. So that process, that feedback loop gets fatigued. That's what that actually means. So, in many ways, adrenal fatigue is a brain issue more than an actual adrenal issue. All right. But nevertheless, this term has come about adrenal fatigue because the adrenals are responsible for producing a lot of our cortisol and adrenaline and DHEA. And of course, those levels go down low. The more medical term for adrenal fatigue are listed on the slide: HPA axis dysfunction, hypercortisolism, hypocortisolism, stress maladaptation, stress response dysfunction, et cetera, et cetera. One of my favorites is the last one: adaptation to stress with consequences. Okay. Because yes, there's no true such thing as adrenal fatigue, but that's just really more of a naming thing. All right, not the process itself. The process definitely exists. If you were to look at all the research on PubMed or any of these sites and look up HPA axis dysfunction in the body, you will find lots of research studies on this. Okay, so just a point I really want to bring up here. All right. So the adrenal glands are two small glands sit on top of the kidneys on either side of our body. They kind of have two parts to them: the outer shell, which is responsible for producing cortisol, DHEA, a lot of the hormones which regulate our mineral levels, too, by the way. And that's why dehydration can be a symptom of adrenal fatigue as well. And a lot of the aldosterone, mineralocorticoid, steroid hormones, as they're called, also regulate our blood pressure. And that's why we can see either high or low blood pressure with adrenal dysfunction, also. Okay. So, yes, there can be a cause of your high blood pressure or low blood pressure, and that's adrenal dysfunction. And then the part of the adrenal glands, known as the medulla, produce a lot of other hormones. A lot of those are brain hormones, what's known as at least the brain hormones, right? The adrenaline, dopamine. And these are neurotransmitters which regulate mood and mental clarity and focus and energy. Okay. And also just our feel good factors, right? Dopamine, we all know, is our endorphins that helps us to feel good. So those adrenals are really doing a lot. And unfortunately, not given as much importance in the traditional medicine world. Okay. But they're very, very important. So, what are some of the signs of adrenal dysfunction or adrenal fatigue? You can see a bunch of things on here, right? Again, really affecting multiple body systems, okay? Muscle and joint pain, fatigue, metabolic issues, weight gain, muscle loss, poor detoxification. Okay. Even hypothyroidism can be due to adrenal dysfunction. Okay. Ovarian or female hormone imbalances. A lot of the mood related symptoms or brain related symptoms, cravings, inflammation, autoimmunity, allergies, pain, and there's a whole host more. These are just some of the most common ones. So, really, the adrenal hormones are affecting most of our organs and tissues in the body. Chronic stress is also linked to, aside from various symptoms, multiple health conditions as well. So there's some research proving this. I'm not going to go over these next several slides in detail, but they're all in there for you. So when you get your recording, feel free to look through these and help yourself to understand. But you can see again, adrenal dysfunction can affect our immune system, even our cholesterol, the way our body processes cholesterol. Right. So some people come in to me saying, "Gosh, I don't understand why my cholesterol's high. I eat so well. I don't, eat these foods." Could stress be causing your high cholesterol? Absolutely, it could be. Okay. And why does stress cause issues? Because of the hormones that it impacts. And remember, hormones are chemical messengers. Hormones' job are to go and deliver important chemical messages to our body, telling it what to do. So obviously, if those hormones are not delivering their messages properly, we see dysfunction. Okay. So stress causes hormone imbalances, which cause dysfunctional signals to our body. That's the basic physiological or biochemical mechanism through which stress affects body systems. So metabolic syndrome, autoimmune conditions, specific one called multiple sclerosis, cancer, diabetes, gut dysfunction can very much be due to chronic stress. That's true too, by the way. If you have gut dysfunctions, they can cause adrenal dysfunction. Male and female hormones can get affected. Thyroid gland can definitely get affected. Vice versa is true here too. Thyroid issues can cause adrenal issues and vice versa. So there's really no escaping the stress response. Now, the purpose of all of this is not to stress you out, it's just to make you more mindful and understanding and actually give you the knowledge and power to understand that, okay, if stress is playing such a big role in so many different conditions, if I can find ways to heal and treat and work on stress management and the biochemistry disruption that stress causes, I can then theoretically improve and fix a lot of different conditions in the body too, right? So you want to think of this in a positive spin, not a negative spin, because yes, the reality is we live in a world where, we all are undergoing probably chronic stress. Now, there's many different determinants, which factor into how we handle stress, right? So there's the stress, there's the perceived stress, and then there's our stress handling capacity. People that personality wise or genetically have good stress handling capacities, they obviously have better adrenal dysfunction. But then other people, either because of genetics, it's not always about willpower, by the way. Okay. It could be our genetics, also childhood trauma or post traumatic stress. If you've dealt with something that was extremely a traumatic experience, all of these things are going to increase your risk of adrenal dysfunction. Okay, it's important to understand that. But again, it's also important to understand that there are things we can do to control this, take control, and do something about it. So, can we measure the status and function of our stress response? Okay, yes, we can, right? A lot of times people with adrenal dysfunction, they'll look okay and they'll go and get all these tests done. And for the most part, everything looks okay, right? So you go to the doctor and, your doctor says, good news, all your tests were negative. And you say, well, how can that be? I'm always tired and fatigued and no energy and headaches and I can't lose weight and all these different things. I'm inflamed and aches and pains. All these things are happening. How can everything be normal? Okay. That's a classical, right? If you feel that way, very classical of adrenal dysfunction. Now, you probably have adrenal dysfunction. Something else could be causing your adrenal dysfunction, which means you have to look deeper. Okay. But the symptoms directly are most likely due to adrenal dysfunction. Okay. So, in other words, if a lot of the symptoms are due to mold exposure, chronic Lyme, okay, gut imbalances, or whatever it might be, those can cause adrenal dysfunction. But the symptoms directly are due to adrenal dysfunction. So you want to work on healing the adrenals biochemically, but you also want to fix whatever the root causes are, which are causing the adrenal dysfunction to begin with. It's a two-part process. If you're only working on one of those sides and not both of those sides, you may not get the complete benefits of healing. Okay. So how do we test? How do we know? There's various different ways we can test, but the standard, the gold standard out there, which is the one that's been the most studied in published clinical trials and been around for years and years and years, are salivary cortisols, actually measuring cortisol levels through saliva testing. Okay. Um, when you test cortisol levels through blood testing, you are looking more for disease, not necessarily your response, the way your body responds to stress. There's a big difference, right? The way your body responds to stress versus disease. So let me give you an example. All right. If you have high cortisol, most people, that high cortisol is probably related to stress, right? Some sort of a stressor that's causing that high cortisol, just as we've been discussing so far. However, some people will have high cortisol because of a disease. For example, something known as um, Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's syndrome means you have a tumor, which is a benign tumor sitting on your adrenal glands producing excess cortisol levels. All right. That may have nothing to do with your stress response. That's a tumor in your adrenals producing high cortisol. That is a medical issue, and that's going to be treated differently. Okay. Um, the opposite is true too. Low cortisol. Most commonly, low cortisols are due to chronic stress. Remember, your cortisols were high for too long. They can't stay high anymore. Now they've dropped low. Chronic stress, right? But if you have a low blood cortisol level, that can also be due to a disease known as Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune condition in which your immune system is attacking your adrenal glands, and now you can't produce cortisol. Again, this is a disease. So it's very important when you have these high or low cortisols that you rule out the disease state, because treatment of the disease is going to be very different from treatment of our stress response. Okay. Again, most thankfully, Addison's and Cushing's are rare. They're not very common. Most of the time, this is going to be our stress response. Okay. All right. So anyway, if we do testing, usually whether we're doing, saliva testing or more commonly these days, urine testing, specifically dried urine testing, has become more common to test our actual cortisol levels. But generally speaking, most of the tests are going to give you a total cortisol, right? Is your total production through the day too high or too low? It's going to give you a total DHEA, which is the other sort of balancing hormone. We're not focusing on that hormone as much during this talk, but also a very important hormone, adrenal hormone, okay? And then it's going to give you sort of a pattern throughout the day. Our normal circadian rhythm, we should wake up in the morning with high cortisols. It takes its biggest drop midday, right in the afternoon. And that's why most people have a little bit of an afternoon slump. Believe it or not, that's normal. Naps, afternoon fiestas, things like that. Those are very common in the United States in the past, not so much anymore with our modern world, but even other countries today where naps are kind of, it's just part of our day. It's part of our circadian rhythm. So our cortisol is supposed to go down a little bit in the afternoon, making us a little bit sleepy. If it's excessive sleepiness and you can't really, go through it, that's of course adrenal dysfunction. Okay. But anyway, then after the afternoon, it kind of goes down gradually throughout the day to be lowest at night. So we're able to get into that deep, restful state of sleep. Okay. So when we are measuring these cortisol curves, if we see an imbalance of the pattern, suppose we see low morning cortisols, we're going to be tired. We're going to be brain foggy. Okay. We might feel very anxious because we don't have enough stress hormone to handle even regular stressors that you might not have even thought of to be a stressor in the past. Okay. Because we just don't have that stress hormone. We might even be depressed. Okay. Those are common, symptoms of, or inflamed. Those are common symptoms of low daytime cortisols. What if we have elevated nighttime cortisols? We're going to have insomnia. We're not going to be able to sleep. We may have racing thoughts. We have, may have pain or inflammation at night, right? So it's not just about your total cortisol throughout the day, but the pattern also matters. We all have a certain circadian rhythm, and research has shown that if we have the right circadian rhythm, our body just works better. Okay. So, yes, you can measure this and see exactly what's going on. So, what are the main drivers of adrenal dysfunction? Perceived mental emotional stress and overwork. That includes overexercise too, by the way. If you're just, physiologically exercising too much, you can drive your adrenals into fatigue. Dietary stress, particularly poor blood sugar control and food allergies. Those are the most common, sort of, if that persists and that just continues long term, can cause adrenal dysfunction. Number three is pain and hidden inflammation. Those are chronic infections, parasites, too much bacteria in your, wrong kind of bacteria in your gut, candida or yeast overgrowth, Lyme, chronic viruses, mold, okay, et cetera, et cetera. And then number four, lack of sleep and circadian disruption, right? We just talked about that circadian rhythm. So some things are controllable, some things we can do something about. Some of them we may not be able to do something about, but it's the overall threshold of stress that matters. So whatever is controllable, whatever we can do things about, if we work on those, we can still heal and improve your adrenal function. Okay, that's an important takeaway point to remember here. It's not like because I have this particular chronic life stressor, I'm just doomed, to adrenal dysfunction. Now, yes, it takes work, it takes effort to overcome this. I never said treating the adrenals is easy, but it is definitely doable. It's just that it does involve investing your time and effort and learning about it and taking care of it. Okay. So healing the adrenals is what I call repairing a beach ball with holes in it. Okay. It's very important to identify and treat the causes of stress. Those are think of those like the holes in the beach ball, right? So whether it be mental, emotional, or overwork stress, whether it be dietary stressors, whether it be hidden gut infections, we have to find those causes, as I've mentioned a couple times already, and fix those causes that are leading to the adrenal dysfunction to begin with. All right. And then there's the blowing the air back into the beach ball, which is the second part of this biochemical rebalance through the use of supplements. Strengthen that beach ball, revive it. Okay. You can use certain adaptogenic herbs and vitamins, certain glandulars, adrenal hormone replacement therapy. Okay. And there's other treatments as well, but these are some of the big ones. Otherwise, it's like you're just blowing a beach ball with holes in it. You're not going to get anywhere. So it's not enough for those people that think, oh, I'm going to take these adrenal supplements and feel better. You may feel better. Okay. But you're not really fixing the issue if you don't address the holes. Okay, very important to make sure, again, you're working on both sides of the fence. Okay, and the opposite can be true too, right? Some people come in saying, gosh, I'm doing all these things to, minimize stress and heal all the causes of stress, but I'm still not feeling better. Well, you may seal off the holes, but you still need the air on the beach ball, right? For it to be perfect. So again, it really, really matters to work on both sides of the fence. Okay. Also, on just this whole analogy with beach ball, I healthy adrenal glands like a soccer ball, right? It's harder, it can take a lot more kicks and hits and stressors, right? But then over time, if you keep kicking that poor soccer ball, it's going to go poof, right? It's going to turn into that beach ball and just get poofed out, right? So again, repairing it, rehealing it back into that soccer ball is going to be very important. It takes a fourfold approach, right? All of these four things that we just spoke about. One is stress reduction and lifestyle changes. Two is dietary modifications. Three is identify those sources of chronic inflammation and fix them. Okay. Toxin exposures, infections, trauma, injury. And then finally, four, biochemical rebalance through the use of targeted, appropriate supplements. If your cortisol's high during a particular time of the day, you want to take something before that to bring it down. If your cortisol is low at a particular time of the day, you want to take something before that to bring it up so that you can rebalance that circadian rhythm or that graph that we saw before. So we want to use supplements in a very targeted way to reshape or realign these hormones the way they're meant to be biochemically in the body. Okay. So let's start with stress. What is stress? Stress is the simple definition is when your body has to respond to a demand for change. Okay. When do we feel stress? The most common reason we feel stress is when we feel like we don't have control over a certain situation. Okay, remember that. It's very important. When we don't have control over a situation, we feel stressed. Sometimes we may have stress, we know we have stress, but we feel like that situation is controllable or manageable because we have resources or we know it's short lived or whatever it might be. And then it's not really affecting the body in the same negative way. All right. So control over stress is kind of main determining factor of how that's going to act in your body with the release of hormones. So, therefore, the perception of stress matters, how you decide to react to the stress. I put this picture in here. I just kind of give an example, right? Suppose that you have an airplane and you look down out of the window, and this is the scene you see. Some people will look at the scene in the airplane and they'll be terrified, right? They'll be like, oh my gosh, we're so high above the earth. And, what if the plane crashes? And what if we all die? And the whole time you're up there, you're releasing all this cortisol and adrenaline and just kind of going into that vicious cycle. This has never happened and it may not happen, but you are thinking it is. That's the perceived stress. Again, your body reacts the same as if that actual stressor happened. Okay. And then you've got, other people looking at that scene and they just feel at peace. And, oh, that's so beautiful. It's so serene. I feel so, at peace, right? Those people are not releasing any cortisol. And it's again a different reaction. So, same situation, different responses. Okay. So, yes, you have control over how you can respond to a situation. Is it easy? No. Okay. Does it take practice? Yes. Is it doable? Yes. Okay. So, therapy, support groups, and just various other resources, which I'll, also list on, future slides over here, can be very, very helpful. And if this is something you can kind of focus on and train yourself on, you can actually reduce your risk of multiple different health conditions, right? So again, there's just different examples listed on this particular slide. Um, and you don't not stressful either, like it says on the cartoon. I'm learning how to relax, doctor, but I want to relax better and faster. I want to be on the cutting edge of relaxation, right? So relaxation means just that, relax, right? Don't make that a stressor as well. Something that truly causes that relaxation response. And remember, the number one thing in healing adrenal dysfunction is going to be sleep. It's our ultimate reset button. I put the slide in here again. You saw that earlier, but I kind of think of sleep as our battery charger, right? When we're sleeping at night, we're charging our battery. And so if we're sleep deprived and if we're not getting sleep, then we're not going to have that charge to be able to carry out all the functions our body's supposed to carry out. Okay. So the number one thing to work on to help with adrenal dysfunction or chronic fatigue is sleep, fix your sleep. Now, some people are not sleeping because of external causes, right? They're just not sleeping because of lifestyle, poor lifestyle, or whatever. And then some people are truly having problems with sleep. I'm trying to sleep, but I can't sleep. Now, that's where, again, the vicious cycle part comes in because it could be adrenal dysfunction. Say you have a high cortisol at night, you're fighting a tiger at night, right? We said high cortisol is fighting a tiger. So if you have a high cortisol at night biochemically, and that's the response your body has now gotten used to, you're not going to be able to sleep. It's physiologically impossible. So that's where the biochemical part comes in, right? We may want to test that. If that's the case, we want to give you supplements to drop that nighttime cortisol so you're able to sleep. Okay. And of course, there's other causes, biochemical causes of poor sleep. Those need to be looked at and addressed, whether it be low serotonin, low progesterone, hyperthyroid, too much thyroid, low blood sugar, liver issues, etc. So the most important part of stress, as we mentioned, is how we react to it. Our body works better when we perceive a sense of control over our stress. Okay, that's why daily stress reduction techniques really matter. Again, it's not easy, but very important to manage stress in our life. These practices can help decrease the severity of existing disease and reducing the risk of developing further diseases, including autoimmune conditions, right? Mindfulness is kind of a wonderful practice and shown in multiple research trials to actually measurably control cortisol levels. Okay. And again, these are just some resources down here at the bottom of the slide to seek out, resources to help with that process. So it's kind of like, what's known as rebalancing the stress bucket, right? I think of stress as this bucket. And everybody, again, we're all exposed to stress, but it matters what your threshold is. Okay. Your threshold matters. You can keep that tap on and keep filling the bucket. It's only when you reach beyond that threshold of stress will you feel the actual mechanics or the disease part of it. Okay. But if you have stress relievers, as you can see on the bottom right there, that you put these holes in the bucket so that, we can keep letting some of that water out, then we can prevent that bucket from getting overfilled. Okay. So again, meditation, prayer, journaling, music, massage, time in nature, laughter, all of those things. Think of those as draining this bucket from building up where it overflows. Okay. We've got everyday stressors. We've got kind of the major stressors. Major stressors are the ones that are a little bit more difficult to control. They just happen. We didn't really have much control or say over it. Some life event just happened, et cetera. So those are the harder ones to control. The everyday stressors, we do have a certain amount of control over that. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's the predisposing factors, right? Genetics, family history, childhood traumas, things like that. So stress is less harmful if you have control, or even if you believe you have control. Okay, if it's predictable. So if you know there's a stressful event coming up, and if you know, hey, you know what, this is going to cause a little bit pinch, but it's only going to last 2 months, and you kind of remind yourself and tell you that, believe it or not, you can reduce that stress response in your body. Okay, so again, if you know that duration, if you have a coping mechanism, if you have a way to relieve the stress, if you have a positive attitude, and if you're an active participant in that process, all of these things can help reduce the side effects of stress or the distress. Okay. Because we can't control stress always necessarily. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, but we can control to a large extent its side effects or distress in the body, create more holes in that bucket so it doesn't overflow. Kind of think of this as like a rubber band, right? So the more stress we have, think of every time you have stress, you're stretching that rubber band, right? And then you stretch it and stretch it and stretch it. But every time you're doing um, stress management techniques, you're reducing the pull on the rubber band and so it's how buoyant or how elastic that is. If you keep on having stress without creating the resilient part of it, it's going to eventually snap, causing disease, right? But if you keep doing the self-care and the love and the meditation, all that sort of stuff, community appreciation, then you reduce that elasticity, right? And you have, again, you increase that elasticity. So you have more of that rebound effect, which is what we want to keep. When we lose that rebound effect is when disease sets in. So, it's like anything else, it's more important to prevent this than, to reverse it. But you can absolutely reverse it. It's just something you want to work on in a very targeted way. A lot of times I tell people, yeah, there's going to be some hard work, but work smart, not only work hard. Okay. So let's work smart. Let's know exactly what's going on and then really try to kind of work with this with appropriate targeted lifestyle changes and appropriate targeted nutritional supplements or hormones. Again, another, cartoon there in the perceivance of stress, right? It says here that the sun will explode in 10 billion years. Well, then we'd better start panic buying. So that can play a big role too. Suppose you can't control your emotional or mental stressors. Diet, you might have a little bit more control over. So if you have adrenal fatigue, and the adrenal fatigue really relates more to just very low cortisol. That's the burnout. That's the chronic fatigue. That's the brain fog. That's the depression. That's the anxiety. That's kind of the pain and inflammation, and you're just feeling horrible, right? That's your typical sort of adrenal dysfunction there. In that kind of situation, it's very important you balance your blood sugar through the day. You don't want to keep fluctuating. You don't want to be doing different meal times and, keep eating things that are going to spike the blood sugar too quickly, like sugars and simple carbs, and not getting enough foods that are going to balance your blood sugar, like proteins and healthy fats, right? So the whole blood sugar component, very important. And then figuring out if there's foods you have intolerances or sensitivities to and avoiding those because those create inflammation in the body. Okay. The cortisol hormone that we've been talking about, that's similar to hydrocortisone. Okay. What's prednisone? Prednisone is synthetic or man-made cortisol. They said, wow, powerful anti-inflammatory actions of cortisol in the body. Let's make something like it, right? And so we produced prednisone. So cortisol is too low. We lose that anti-inflammatory effect of cortisol or hydrocortisone, right? That's why we have more pain and inflammation in the body. Okay. So again, important to understand that. And of course, if our cortisol is low, we lose our ability to trigger our immune system against illnesses as well. And you will be getting these slides, so please feel free to, read through those in more detail. These are just some, a wonderful slide that I really liked that really helps to explain why to do these certain targeted important things. If you have adrenal fatigue, this may not always be the case for people that have high cortisols, or maybe even, stage two, right? The wired but tired. So generally speaking, high cortisol is known as the wired response. The stage two, which is the middle, is known as wired but tired. And then stage three is the very low cortisol. So this slide is best for those people that have the low cortisols or kind of in the middle, but more towards the low. All right. It's important to understand that. So, yes, targeted dietary changes can be very, very helpful. In fact, necessary to heal. Another little cartoon there, right? Just be careful what you eat. Try to eat real food. If there's only one thing you can do, and it's very too hard to make diet changes. If there's only one thing you can do, I'd like you to start with just eating real food, right? Without additives, preservatives, a lot of chemicals or junk in it. That alone can make a big difference. So identify sources of chronic infection, right? If you have chronic hidden gut infections, you can do this through stool testing. If you have any chronic or severe acute trauma or injury, you need to work on that and heal that. Toxin exposures like heavy metals, chemicals in the body, and then various other conditions. Again, these are things that can be identified and worked on. Okay. Rebalance with supplements. Again, kind of, talked about this already. And, these do need to be targeted. Sure, there are certain generalized nutrients we can take because we need nourishment for the adrenals. So generalized vitamins and minerals can be very helpful, but we also want to make sure we're taking targeted supplements to really help our patterns. So George F. Burns, he was an American comedian and a centenarian, which means he lived to be 100 or over. He said, he quoted, if you ask what is the single most important key to longevity, I would have to say it is avoiding worry, stress, and tension. And if you didn't ask me, I'd still have to say it, right? So again, I know this is not easy. It's much easier said than done. But if we have the tools and the resources and the understanding and the education to kind of know what we can do and how we can do it, it really can be done. Okay. So thank you. I know this was a long topic and I know I kind of went a little bit quickly and there's really a lot more on here. If I had to talk everything about adrenal dysfunction, I would probably have to do this over, 3 to 5 sessions. But I really wanted to, the goal today was really trying to get that understanding out there. And, if you feel like you have a lot of these symptoms or dysfunctions and you don't know what's triggering it and you've been told that everything is normal and you don't feel normal, you could very well have adrenal dysfunction. Okay. But treating adrenal dysfunction is a journey. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I will tell you, it can take a year or sometimes two to really kind of heal or overcome adrenal dysfunction, but it can be done. But if you don't do anything about it, things will just get worse and worse and worse over time. All right. So it's very important to break that cycle, work on your health, and try to reverse and come out of this. Okay. Um, This is just more information on our contact info. Please feel free. Like I said, at this point, please feel free to chat any questions into the chat box. I'll try to address those. But suppose you forgot to ask something or you want to ask something later, please feel free to call our office or send us an email. And I'll go ahead and put our email and website information in the chat box in just a moment as well. Please feel free to contact us, ask any questions you further have. I would be happy to, respond back to those. Okay. And then if you feel like, this is something that you want to look into, again, please feel free to call our office. And we would love to be able to help you out. Okay. So thank you so much. You've been an absolutely wonderful audience. It's not easy talking about these things on a Wednesday evening, but please feel free. I'll go ahead and give you a few minutes to type in some questions into the chat box.